Here are some helpful coding tips for working on your vibraphone virtual musical instrument. Begin by looking in your distribution for MIDI jam session and identify the prototype instrument. Incidentally, these are now called VMIs, or virtual musical instruments. And also copy over the two files I'm indicating for note info, and that will be necessary to properly open up the prototype instrument. Begin by renaming that to something that makes sense for your project. In this case, we're designing the sound for vibraphone, or vibes for short. And after you've read over the instructions and have some idea of the requirements, you can delete all of that information. And also, you will then be able to then paste in, say, a code fragment that you've developed earlier. Here's my existing work on the attack and decay portion of the envelope generator. Now, it says do not modify, but it's perfectly acceptable to tap an existing signal like the sampling frequency, which is necessary for me to calculate or convert my attack and decay time in seconds into samples. Also, you can add additional features such as waveform graphs or waveform players and what have you. So when you're doing your debugging or development and debugging, you can pretty much ignore the primary interfaces that have the do not modify labels and just more or less do your own thing here. So what I'd like to do is try to do some stepwise refinement of my envelope generator. Just see how we're doing. We've got some controls that are set to 0, so that's not very helpful. Let's make a finite value for that. Also, I see that some of my controls are overlapping themselves on the front panel, so let me scoot those off to the side. We also need a finite value for sampling frequency before we can make much headway here. Okay, so there's my attack portion of the envelope running from minus 40 dB to 0. Say for the decay portion, then I'll use the same idea with the constants flipped around, so it starts at 0 and ends at minus 40. For joining the segments together, use the build array, but specifically set the concatenate mode, or concatenate inputs mode on that. So let's take a look at how we're doing now. Again, I need to get a finite value for decay. I'll make that quite a bit longer. I'll make that 3 seconds. And that would be actually some typical values. You might even find that a shorter attack time is required to make a realistic sound for the vibraphone instrument. All right, let me point out some other areas of interest for you. You might find that when you're trying to add together a bunch of arrays or different values, you can use the compound operator where you can select addition, which is the default, and then you can add as many things as you like at that single node. Sometimes that's a little more convenient than using a whole bunch of 2-input addition nodes. For the calculation associated with decibels, or undoing the decibels equation, so to speak, you'll find the 10 to the x power calculator handy. Also, as I say, it's okay to put down additional components for the purposes of development. So if you wanted to listen to some results, you could include the play waveform. Remember that anytime you use the play waveform express VI, you need to actually give it the waveform data type instead of the array data type. So for example, if we had our finished result coming into that compound addition node, then we could send that to the Y input of the build waveform node. You would also need to provide it with its step size, or DT as it's called, which is simply the reciprocal of the sampling frequency. At that point, we've converted our array into the waveform data type, and we can actually listen to the result. Now what I'd recommend is to get closer to making your final virtual musical instrument. You could then take your front panel controls and convert those to constants. But here's a technique where I'm showing you that you can make the label visible, and that way you don't have a bunch of unnamed constants laying around, which you'll almost certainly forget what they are fairly quickly. But as I say, as you get closer to getting your finished result put together for your VMI, you have to strip out anything in terms of front panel controls and indicators that does not belong, and that becomes the virtual instrument that you actually need. So I'll also remind you to change out the name. Again, I'm switch the name to VMI instead of MVI as I have here. But go ahead and modify the icon to give a meaningful name for your virtual musical instrument. By the way, you can use the arrow keys to kind of nudge the position of the text around once you've typed it in. Also, continue to modify your documentation to make it specific to your design. And also, if you look under File and VI Properties, which you can also access as Control-I, under Documentation, this should also be updated to make it specific to your design.